All right, so let's just do a little bit of review from last week. Chapter 10, this first part of chapter 10 is a continuation of the scene from chapter 9. Do you need, oh, yeah, thanks for reminding me, Sarah. Anybody need questions that doesn't have them? Is you, Sarah? Yep, here you go. You're welcome. So this part of chapter 10 continues on from chapter 9. But now Jesus is going to directly address some things with the Pharisees. So let's talk about what happened in chapter 9. What was going on when we left off last week?
He healed the blind man.
Mm-hmm. He did. Healed the blind man, and how did that go? I mean, obviously the healing worked, but you know, what happened after that?
It was the Sabbath, and he violated their rules.
Yes, by making the mud.
So obviously he couldn't be God.
Right. And it wasn't that Jesus had a conversation with the Pharisees about whether he was from God. Who had the conversation with them?
The man who was healed.
That's so fascinating. It's the blind man who had the conversation with the Pharisees and confronted them, basically confronted him about the ridiculousness of what they were saying about Jesus. So their whole claim was he can't be from God because look how he broke the Sabbath traditions. What was the argument of the blind man who's not blind anymore?
Well, I mean, he said, I don't know, but I was blind and now I can see. Is that what you're...
Yeah, and then he said, they're like, we know he's a sinner.
No,
And the
they
blind
said,
man's
that
like-
God doesn't listen to sinners.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
How could he open my eyes if he's not from God? Which is even more pointed if you know the prophecies from Isaiah that say when the Messiah comes, this is one of the things that he'll do is to open people's eyes. So here's this blind man who's just listening to all this stuff from the Pharisees and he is not buying it. And he just stands up to them and they don't like it and they throw him out. They cast him out of the synagogue. Okay, what happened after that? Jesus went and found him. How did that go?
Yes, he hasn't even known who Jesus is. He's never seen him.
Right.
Because Jesus wasn't on the scene when
That's right.
And Jesus said, yes, I have.
Yeah.
I'm the one that you can see.
Now you've seen him. And the man believes, which is the complete opposite of what happened back in chapter 5 with the invalid who basically experienced the same thing. Jesus went and found him, said, stop sinning or something worse is going to happen to you, and he threw Jesus under the bus. But this guy, when he meets Jesus, he immediately worships him. And we talked last week about how there's a sort of double miracle going on there, which I think is the big point of that whole healing of the blind man, which is it's not just that he has his physical eyes open, he has his spiritual eyes open. That's what the Messiah has ultimately come to do. Not to open people's physical eyes, but to open their spiritual eyes. And he does that for the man. But so many of the Pharisees who think they can see get more blind as the passage goes on. Yeah. So at the end, they were like, we're not blind, are we? And Jesus, in a very tongue-in-cheek way, said, well, you think you're not, which is the problem. The fact that you think you can see makes you reject the light, which makes you more blind than when you started. Okay, now, the bit that comes now in chapter 10 is a continuation of that conversation with the Pharisees. So he confronted their blindness last week, but now he's going to confront something else. If you read the two chapters in isolation, it might look like they're dealing with completely different subjects, but they're not, because the common theme between them is true and false leadership. So now Jesus is going to move on from blindness, and he's going to talk about their mistreatment of God's people. And everything that Jesus is going to say in this passage is to be understood against the background of what just happened to the blind man and how the shepherds of Israel treated him and how Jesus is completely different from that. Okay, now I should have told you this before we get into chapter 10, we're actually going to read part of Ezekiel 34. And the reason is because this provides some really pointed background about the shepherds of Israel and what God has to say about what they're doing and what he's going to do in response. So I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but I'll read part of it, Ezekiel 34, starting in verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and when they were scattered they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for the flock. Therefore, O shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines and in all the settlements in the land. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. As for you, my flock, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will judge between one sheep and another, and between rams and goats. Is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture? Must you also trample the rest of the pasture with your feet? Is it not enough for you to drink clear water? Must you also muddy the rest with your feet? Must my flock feed on what you have trampled and drink what you have muddied with your feet? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says to them. See, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. Because you shove with flank and shoulder, butting all the weak sheep with your horns until you have driven them away, I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. Okay, now here's this prophecy that's given at the time of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel was a prophet when Israel had been exiled. So this is right after the destruction of Jerusalem, when the southern kingdom has been taken away into exile in Babylon. And so here's this prophecy against all the shepherds. Okay, who's he talking about when he talks about the shepherds? Leaders.
And
Yep.
maybe the priests.
Yep, I think all of that. The kings, the priests, the prophets, all of these people who were responsible for leading God's people. And what have they done? How have they treated the people of God? Yeah, badly. Yeah, that's right.
Well, in every way, and they're not feeding, they're not taking care of them, they're not protecting them. So
They're wandering off and getting lost. The shepherds aren't doing anything about it. And all of this has a spiritual application, that the people who are supposed to be the spiritual leaders of God's people are just letting them wander off and get lost and be devoured, and they're not doing. In fact, they're even killing the sheep themselves. They're taking advantage of the sheep themselves. What does God say he's going to do about that? Mm-hmm. And he says he's going to shepherd the people, and then he says the descendant of David's going to shepherd the people. So which is it? Both. Because what's he going to do? He's going to come as a descendant of David. God himself is going to come and be the shepherd in the person of the Messiah. And so all this is spoken in the context of the exile, but when we get to John 10, it is so relevant for everything that Jesus is about to say in the context that he's in, where, okay, well, let's talk about this. What are the shepherds doing to the people? Think about what just happened with the blind man. Think about all the stuff we've seen through John. How are they treating him?
They're not taking care of the flock. They're not taking care of the weak, the injured of the sheep, the ones that are hungry. They're not actually caring for a flock. They're just, picking out the ones that are fat to raise them to eat for themselves. And so they're not taking care of the body.
Right. They're using the sheep for their own purposes, right? They're exploiting the sheep. We saw this even back when Jesus cleared the temple. They're using the temple to make money. They care more about their power and their authority and their position than they care about the well-being of the people they're supposed to be shepherding. And how did we see that in chapter 9? A guy who's standing there speaking the truth, both about what happened to him and about who opened his eyes, calling them out on their hypocrisy, and their response to the sheep is to throw him out. So here's Jesus who's he's gonna confront those leaders right here with this imagery that they should know, because they should know Ezekiel 34. And when he says what he says, it's a very pointed way of saying, you all are those shepherds from Ezekiel 34. And he is the total contrast to that, because he's the descendant of David, who has come to actually shepherd the flock the way they should be shepherded. Okay, so let's look at John 10, verses 1 to 21. Chapter 10, verse 1. I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore Jesus said again, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. At these words the Jews were again divided. Many of them said, he is demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? Okay, so after Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees at the end of chapter 9, how does he start in chapter 10, verse 1?
He just says, I'm the way, like kind of setting it up for that.
Mm-hmm.
His role as being the shepherd.
Yeah. He says something really pointed to the Pharisees in verse 1. He starts with the criticism of them. What does he say?
It is not that they come in by another way.
Yeah. And did you notice that he doesn't start by saying, well, he starts by saying, truly, truly, verily, verily, it's like, pay attention. And then he says, I tell you, the Pharisees, anyone who does not enter by the sheep pen, enter the pen by the gate, but climbs over some other way is a thief and a robber. What's he getting at? He's not just calling them bad shepherds. He's calling them thieves and robbers. Like, he's gone a little beyond Ezekiel 34 right now and said, you all you're more than just illegitimate shepherds. You're thieves and robbers because of the way that they're treating the people. Okay, now let's just talk for a minute about the background of this. So typically, people who owned sheep would pen them up at night in an enclosure with stone walls that had one gate or one door, your translation might say, in and out. So there's one way in and out, and instead of each family having their own pen, it was common that multiple families in a neighborhood would share a pen. So all of their sheep would be mixed together in one pen at night, and then the families would hire someone to guard the gate. Now, obviously, anyone who comes into the sheep pen by climbing over the wall is up to no good, right? Because shepherds come in by the gate. Thieves climb over the wall. So here's Jesus, against the background of what just happened with this blind man, calling out the people who would presume to lead God's flock, but who are actually fleecing the sheep instead of shepherding them. That's what they're doing to the people of God, and Jesus just says it in a very straightforward way by the way he refers to, well, really, he's referring to them as the thieves and the robbers. And that, I think, the people who are coming in over the wall, that includes false teachers, people who pretend to be the Messiah, as well as these religious leaders who really don't care about the sheep themselves. It's just a really strong rebuke by Jesus, and it stands against the background of Ezekiel 34, where any of those leaders who know Ezekiel should be hearing a criticism that comes straight out of the Old Testament when Jesus calls them out the way that he does.
So Sally, I was thinking that as you were reading that and giving that background, they did get it. They just didn't.
I think they did too, because of how they respond at the end.
Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't be, if you didn't get the analogy.
You wouldn't be offended, would you?
Like, all right.
Yeah, that was a nice story about a sheep and a shepherd. That's right. Yeah. Okay, now, who does Jesus contrast with the thieves and the robbers in 2-5?
Those who have come before him, false leaders, false prophets.
So all of that is included, yeah, in the false shepherds. And then he changes to a contrast with them in 2-5. Now what's the contrast?
The good shepherd, the one who knows the sheep,
Yeah.
has one who actually has right to claim the sheep.
Right. Here's the legitimate shepherd. And the legitimate shepherd comes in through the gate. He doesn't have to sneak in because the gatekeeper opens the gate for him. And not only that, but the sheep recognize his voice. Now this is interesting because this is how the shepherds separated their sheep. So you have all these sheep who are mixed together in one pen. The shepherd comes in the morning to lead his sheep out to pasture. How does he get the sheep out? Well, you could go around to each sheep individually and drag it out of the pen, but that's not what they did.
Calls
The
them
shepherd,
by name.
yeah, the shepherd would stand outside the pen and he would call, and his sheep would come out because they recognize his voice. But generally, the shepherd would just have some kind of generic, hey, let's go, kind of thing. But you caught the bit that Jesus said where he doesn't just stand there with a generic kind of let's go. He calls the sheep by name. He knows every one of his sheep by name, and he calls them out using their name. And then what?
Goes ahead of them so that they follow him, and they follow him because they know his voice. My Bible in verse 5 says, the stranger they simply will not follow.
That's right. In fact, they run the other way
Yeah.
because they don't recognize the stranger's voice. And, well, let's talk for a minute about the fact that he leads them out. Okay, so we're in Wyoming. This is easy. How do you drive cattle? From behind. That's why we call it a cattle drive, right? It's because you're driving them from behind. If you have a couple of them, you have just a couple cattle, you use a stick to the backside. If you have a whole herd of them, you use horses, dogs, and ATVs, right? And you force them in a certain direction by just keeping behind them and making them go this way or this way. How is Jesus different? He leads. What difference does that make for us?
There's an obedience there on the part of the follower,
Mm-hmm.
and like a knowledge of the shepherd as the only one that can move you in that direction.
And it also assumes more intelligence that we are responsible for keeping our eyes on him and not just being goaded from behind.
I think there's a safety with that too, because as the cattle actually get moved on our land, so I get to watch them get moved from our pasture to another pasture, and we sometimes have to move them. And if they're leading in front, when you lead in front, you can see and change that. Like we had that where they actually got messed up because they didn't realize the gate had been open when they were doing the drive, and all of a sudden the cows were going way off track and into another place. And the people who were driving them couldn't prevent that from happening because they weren't ahead to see. Does that make sense? They weren't ahead to be there and be the protection for the cattle. They could kind of push them where they wanted to go, but they still couldn't protect them because they're behind them.
Because they didn't know it.
Right.
Okay, now apply that to Jesus.
Jesus knows what we're gonna go through. He knows, he's felt everything. He's done, he's experienced everything he's gonna tell us. He knows our sorrows, he knows our pains, he knows. So if we're following him, then we know we have a good protection. We know we have somebody who can see that if we're on him, can be like, okay, wait, I need to step aside from this. I need to move around this because my shepherd knows that this is danger.
Yeah, that's really, really well put. And it also implies that, like, you're trusting Jesus, you're walking with him, knowing that he understands every trial, and so you continue to walk with him through that. Like, it's like a trust.
And it's so personal.
Yeah.
It's, what'd you say, Jane?
It's so personal because he knows our name and calls us by name.
And he doesn't send us anywhere he's not willing to go himself.
Right, he's faced every temptation that
That's
we
right.
have faced.
He doesn't stand in the back and say, look, there's a dark cave up there. Let's see what's in there and you go first. Like, it's not like that, right? Everywhere we go, Jesus has gone ahead of us. And you're right, there is protection in just knowing we're not ever going to go someplace where Jesus doesn't know where we're headed. It's not like he's going to send us off someplace and, ooh, there was a cliff there and I didn't. No, Jesus is ahead of us. And if we're following him, he's not going to take us anywhere he's not willing to go himself. He's not going to take us anywhere he hasn't gone first. And he just goes ahead of us and leads us. What a great and personal shepherd that is, to call us by name and then walk ahead of us everywhere we go. Yeah, and the sheep they will follow him because they recognize his voice, but they will not follow a stranger. And we know that Jesus is contrasting himself with all these lousy leaders, that he's the legitimate shepherd. But let's just think about how we saw this played out in chapter 9. Because what Jesus is telling us right here is the interpretation of what just happened with the blind man. How is this related to what the blind man did in chapter 9?
He could have easily have been, humanly been persuaded that, wow, these are the leaders. And there's just that, and we've been there. I think we thought it's like, something doesn't feel right. It's not that it's mystical, but it's like, there's some alert in your spirit.
Yeah.
Well, I think Jesus called the blind man. Right?
Yeah.
He spoke his name, he called it, he knew who he was, he went to him. He called, and that sheep, that blind man, knew his shepherd's voice.
That's right.
So there was that spiritual awakening, he knew it.
And even before he fully knew who Jesus was, you can see him when he's interacting with the Pharisees, refusing to listen to the voice of the shepherds who were not the real shepherds. We talked a little bit about this. How is it that he wasn't cowed by those religious leaders the way everybody else was? Well, I think there's probably a lot going on there, but one of the things I think is he recognized the voice of his shepherd even though he hadn't seen Jesus yet. And he also recognized the voice of those who were not the shepherds. And he's standing up there facing all of these Pharisees and just knowing this is not the truth. It is not the truth. The stuff that they're saying isn't true. And then when did Jesus wait for the blind man to find him? He couldn't because the blind man didn't know what he looked like. Yeah, Jesus went and found him. And as soon as he found the blind man's like, there's my shepherd. Right? I mean, when he worships Jesus, it's a recognition of this is the guy. Doesn't Jesus do that for us too? Like we don't find him. He comes and finds us. And when he finds us, because he already knows us, we recognize the voice of our shepherd because he knows us first. That's so comforting to me to just know my shepherd knows me and he knew me before I knew him. And the reason I know him, the reason I recognized his voice is because he knew me already. And there's a certain, I think, security in that too, in that knowing that not just anybody gets access to the sheep. Not anyone gets spiritual access to the sheep because we have a shepherd whose voice we recognize. Okay, well, we'll continue on with that. Let's keep going. Because when the Pharisees don't understand, in verse 6, Jesus then expands this whole metaphor with different details where he's going to specifically identify himself in the whole metaphor. And to do that, he uses two different illustrations. So he's going to shift the application a little bit right here by using two different illustrations, and maybe it's easier if we just take them separately. So in the first one, which is 7 to 10, what's the illustration that he uses? What does he compare himself to?
The door.
Yeah, the door or the gate. So he says he's the door or the gate to the sheep pen. Okay, and what does he have to say about the door or the gate or himself in those verses?
Anybody who enters through you, he shall be saved.
Mm-hmm.
And he can go in and out and find pasture.
Yep, that's right. So, yeah, go ahead.
Just beside that verse 6, just what makes me wonder why the Pharisees didn't understand it. They know about sheep. They read. If they say they know so much about the Old Testament, and surely they've heard God refer to God's people as sheep. Well, how dense are they?
Well,
how come they didn't apply that?
Because the biggest obstacle to belief is pride. That's why. Yeah. And pride is irrational, and pride blinds you.
It's easier for us to look at it.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, let's think about a gate or a door. A gate or a door has more than one function, right? So it provides security for the sheep because it limits access by outsiders. And at the same time, it provides a way for the sheep to get out and access the pasture. And Jesus says he is that access and he is that security. He's the one who provides security for the sheep because spiritually speaking, they're not accessible to just anyone. The false shepherds who try to preempt Jesus or go around Jesus or substitute for Jesus won't get a hearing by the sheep. That doesn't mean that the sheep are never deceived. That doesn't mean that we as the people of God never believe something that we shouldn't. What it means is that we can recognize our shepherd. We recognize the significance of who he is as the Messiah. In that sense, hearing his voice and seeing the light are the same thing. They're two metaphors for the same reality, which is being able to recognize the Messiah for who he is. So, yeah, it's not possible for his sheep to get the kind of hearing from false shepherds that they get from their own shepherd. And it's not just the false shepherds who don't get in, but there are also no strange sheep that get in either. If Jesus is the gate or the door, then everyone who enters has to enter through him, which means there's no way to belong to the people of God without going through Jesus. Does this sound a little bit like 14:6 when he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life? Because that's what he's saying right here, is the only way to be part of this flock is to come through him. So no strange sheep get in. But everyone who gets in through Jesus will be saved. And then he says his people will not only have the security of belonging to him and being protected by him, but at the same time they'll have access to the pasture. They will have access to everything they need for the life that he offers. They'll have access to all the blessings of Psalm 23, right? And the thieves come to kill and destroy, he says in verse 10, to exploit the sheep for their own gain. But Jesus comes to give life to the sheep, and it's full and abundant life. Okay, now, after calling himself the gate or the door, then Jesus changes the illustration. So how does he describe himself and his people in verses 11 to 13? Yes. And what makes him good in those verses? How's he different from...
He lays down his life for the sheep.
Yes. In contrast to those false shepherds, the bad shepherds, the thieves and robbers masquerading as shepherds, he lays down his life for the sheep. He's willing to die for the sheep. Now, what does he compare that to in 12 and 13?
The hired man doesn't do that.
Right. What does a hired man do?
He leaves, he runs away usually because he doesn't own the sheep.
That's right. He's in it for the money, not for the sheep. And so when he gets threatened, he will run away to save his own skin. But the shepherd doesn't do that. The shepherd will protect the sheep even to the point of dying. And that's not hypothetical. I mean, we know that. The listeners didn't yet, but we know that Jesus isn't just using some exaggeration to talk about this. He's going to do it himself. He's actually going to die for the sheep. And there's nobody else who would do that except a shepherd who loves the sheep, because a hired hand won't do it.
Did you read anywhere that the doorkeeper laid down by the gate and maybe could even sleep as long as the sheep were just quiet.
Mhm.
But he would probably hear if the sheep started fussing around that there
Yeah.
was somebody coming in.
Mhm.
So he was laying down his life in a sense too,
Mhm.
to protect the sheep.
And Jesus just fulfills all of that.
Right.
Yeah. All right, then he keeps going. What does he add to that in 14 and 15?
I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me.
Mhm. Keep
Just
going.
as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep.
Okay, well, let's talk about this. How well does the shepherd know his sheep? The way that you know your property? What's the comparison? What's the relationship between how is the relationship between the sheep and the shepherd different?
Father knows him.
Like children. That's right. It's not a owner-property relationship. It's a father-son relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. Now that's very interesting because how could a shepherd ever know sheep that well? By becoming one himself. And here's the thing, is Jesus is not a sheep in the same sense that we are, but he has become a human being. And by becoming a human being, he understands us as sheep in a way that he wouldn't otherwise. I mean, imagine a shepherd who becomes the sheep so that he can understand the sheep and then turn around and lead them. That's what our shepherd has done for us. And he knows us so well that he knows us the way a father knows a son and vice versa. And then he adds again that he lays down his life for the sheep. The ultimate purpose of salvation, I think I've seen this just over and over in John. The ultimate purpose of salvation is not just to save us from sin and its penalty. It's to bring us into the relationship of love that exists between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. That's where we're headed. That's the ultimate goal, is to be brought into that relationship. And Jesus wants to know us, and he wants us to know him with the same level of intimacy that he knows his Father. That's where we're headed. That's the kind of relationship that we're headed for when Jesus saves us. Okay, now what does he add in verse 16?
It's so confusing. I think it's referring to us.
Mhm.
Okay.
He is. That's
Yeah,
right.
so he's saying, I have sheep that are not of this fold, and I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice.
Mhm.
So I was assuming that he was talking about the Gentiles.
That's
the
right.
Dechert.
That's right. Mhm.
Okay.
And we got a little hint of this back in Ezekiel 34 when he said that he would call his people from all the nations and all the countries. Well, of course, the Jews had been scattered to different places, but there's a bigger vision than that. That he's calling his, right here, what does the sheep pen refer to? To the Jews. But here's Jesus saying he's calling his sheep out not just from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. He has sheep among the Gentiles, and he's going to bring them out too. He knows them by name as well. And they will recognize his voice when they hear it, and they will follow him. Have we had an example of that in John? Of Gentiles who heard the voice of their shepherd? The Samaritans. That's right. That whole Samaritan village, we've already seen a group of Gentiles recognize the voice of their shepherd. And they didn't even see a miracle. They just heard the teaching and recognized their shepherd when they heard his voice. Yep. And then he says, well, what does he say? And then there will be two flocks. We'll have a Gentile flock and a Jewish flock. There will be one flock and one shepherd, which is the fulfillment of Ezekiel 34. That God will come to shepherd his people in the person of the Messiah. There will be one flock, one shepherd. All of the people of God will be brought together under this shepherd. He's not just the Messiah for the Jews. He's the Messiah for us too. Now, all of this poses a serious threat to the authority of the Jewish leaders. Because if Jesus is calling people out, like the blind man, if they're speaking up against the false shepherds the way he did, and if Jesus is creating a new flock that includes Gentiles as well, there's going to be trouble for the Jewish authorities. Now, whether they've worked out all the consequences of that or not, I don't know, but they intuitively know all through John that Jesus threatens their power and their position, and he absolutely does, because he's going to call out his sheep. And when he calls them out, they're going to reject the false teaching that they're hearing. Think about this with the blind man. He simultaneously got thrown out by the false shepherds and called out by the true shepherd. All of that happened at one time. He caused a big ruckus. That whole ruckus was because he recognized the voice of his shepherd. And that puts them on the spot in ways that are going to cause trouble. And they know it. Okay, now, what does he add in 17 and 18?
It's hard to understand. He says, why the Father loves me is because I lay down my life, and yet that's what the Father asked him to do and told him to do, and that's what he did. So the whole relationship between the God in the Godhead is
Yeah.
really hard to
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
I think it is.
It's heavy. And when he says that, obviously he doesn't mean the Father didn't love the Son until he died on the
Yeah,
cross.
right.
We already know that's not the case because the baptism of Jesus made it clear.
Right.
They've loved each other from all eternity. So it's not like he earns the love of the Father when he goes to the cross. But what he's doing is emphasizing the relationship between the Father and the Son as the foundation for everything that Jesus does. And it's important that he reiterates that the love of the Father extends to him when he's on the cross. Because what's the reaction of the Jewish people going to be when they see the Messiah on the cross? Are they going to look at that and say, look how much the Father loves him? Their response is going to be, look how the Father abandoned him. Look, he must be getting what he deserved. He must be a sinner, a criminal, and he's been abandoned because there's no way he would be up there if he hadn't done something to deserve it. And here's Jesus just reiterating that all of this, everything he's doing, including going to the cross, is rooted in the relationship of love between the Father and the Son. The Father always loves the Son, and the Son loves the Father and demonstrates it by his obedience to the things the Father commands, to the works the Father gives him to do, even the ultimate act of obedience, which is dying on the cross. All of that is under this umbrella of the love that exists between the Father and the Son. Were you going to say something to that? No? Okay. And then he says that he lays down his life in order to take it up again. So his death was not an end, it was a means to an end, the end being to defeat sin and death and to bring his people into relationship with him. He says, no one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and authority to take it up. Why do you think he emphasizes that right there? Why does it matter?
Well, he's still a sovereign God, so he's completely in control of all the circumstances leading up to the crucifixion.
Are you saying that he's not a tragic victim?
No. But it must have been hard for him. I mean, he's obviously telling them, like, I'm in complete control.
Yep.
But yet, when he goes to the cross, he just knows everyone's under the assumption that it's over. Even his disciples just don't get it. Even though, would the disciples have believed in the resurrection, in a bodily resurrection at the end of time?
Yes.
Right. So,
Yes.
but they still didn't understand that he was going to be the first.
They didn't understand that he was going to walk out of the grave of
Right.
his own power.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like he had to descend in the sense of actually going down into death.
Mhm.
And then basically saying, you have no control. Death has no control
That's
over
right.
any of me.
That's right. Because, yeah, go ahead, Marilyn.
And that 3 days, he was in hell, right? I mean, we had a pastor teach that.
The Apostles' Creed, I haven't worked all of that out myself, but yeah, that is in the Apostles' Creed that comes from
We
Ephesians.
cannot even comprehend if Jim was right about that, because I was like, I didn't get that. But we can't even comprehend, because he would have been separated from the Father at that time. But he had to trust that through that whole period, God, his Father, still in control,
Yep.
still had him, he lost him,
Yep.
they didn't lock the gate and couldn't get him out.
Mhm.
So that's just amazing.
And there are resurrections in the Old Testament, right? So there's a couple resurrections in 1st and 2nd Kings where Elijah and Elisha raised people from the dead. But what's the difference? Elijah and Elisha have to call on God to do it. When Jesus comes, it's not just that he has the power to say it without calling on God. It's that Jesus can walk out of his own grave. That puts him in a totally different category.
And also, like and I don't know if this is correct, but it also seems like his death, when he actually died, he physically gave his spirit
Yes,
up.
he did.
So it's not like he was, even at the point of death, it was ultimately his sovereign choice.
Yep.
Which is, incredible.
Yeah. And he's going to keep reiterating this to the disciples over and over and over, that when they get to the point of the crucifixion, it's not because he's lost control. He's not in the wrong place at the wrong time and just got on the wrong side of the authorities, and if he just kept his mouth shut a little bit, maybe none of this would have happened. He is fully in control of everything that happens. No one takes his life from him. Not Rome, not Satan, not even the Father. It's Jesus himself who hands his life over and voluntarily submits himself to the plan of the Father. That's so important because go ahead.
Well, and I think it's so important because, and he keeps reiterating what Leah said up to the end, that it is finished. That he is separate, because he also calls himself the Son of Man, but that he is a separate from God, but yet he is also God.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I think he does it a lot. He reiterates it so that we know that there is a separation. That's the 3 in 1, but that it's all one too, so that we would clearly get that, because he also says that I am God, like that he also says that he is God, but he doesn't want people to get the wrong idea that there isn't a separation somehow between the Son and the Father.
Yeah.
And that it is, because that's what it all rests upon, is his humanity, and that his free will, and that he was created man, although divine man, and completely divine, that he had all the other rights and problems and everything that everyone else would have, and that his humility and obedience and of his own free will, that's what the whole peace between God and man would rest upon, is that he was obedient to death, and that he did die for the sins of mankind, that it was his though, that so that we could relate.
Yeah. He wasn't forced into anything. And this is important because I think I mentioned this once a couple months ago, but I saw it again on the internet not too long ago. Somebody who said, I cannot believe in a God who would require child sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
It's cosmic child abuse that the Father would do that to his Son. And I want to say you need to read John chapter 10, because what the Son says is, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord, and I have the authority to do that. Nobody forces Jesus to do this, including the Father.
Yeah.
Jesus chooses this, and he has the authority to choose it because of who he is. Yeah, and that independence, the authority, and the power that he has, and the fact that he makes that choice is huge for our salvation, that he isn't forced into it. He does it because he's the good shepherd, and he lays down his life for his sheep.
If you were forced into it, it would change everything.
Of course it would.
It wouldn't be the same sacrifice. It
Nope.
wouldn't be a sacrifice.
Mm-mm.
It wouldn't be, at least the way I thought, was like, that's not a saving sacrifice.
Nope.
If there is not the choice on his part, then God would have just killed his Son, and there would have been a sacrificial offer on Jesus' part.
That's right.
He's not paying somebody's sin. It would have just been God committed murder.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And then you come away with this perspective of the Father that he's just cruel and capricious, when what Jesus says is that when he goes to the cross, he's actually revealing the nature of the Father as merciful and sacrificial. That you're seeing on the cross the ultimate revelation of who the Father is, of what his character is actually like, when you see Jesus die, because he does it voluntarily.
I told them at Mom Bear, we had friends that and this is kind of not the best analogy, but it was a good analogy for a kid. Their daughter had disobeyed, and she was probably 11 or 12 when it happened, and they were pretty much past the spanking age, but it was a big enough punishment that they're like, you're gonna have to be spanked for this, like this is big. Sent her up to her room to wait, and mom and dad came up, and I think it said it was 5 spankings. They came up, talked to her, said it's time, and then dad laid down on the bed and told her mom, spank me. And he took every spanking, and at that point, the girl's breaking, but she was like, said, you deserve this spanking, this is your punishment, I'm doing what Christ did for you. But he willingly took our punishment for her. And I think that's the same kind of thing, like he willingly took our punishment for him.
Yeah.
But the mystery still is, though, the end of verse 18, where it says, "This commandment I received from my Father." So, I mean, it sounds contradictory in the sense that he says, "I do it of my own initiative," and yet he's saying, "I do it by the commandment of my Father."
But he's not forced to do it
No.
because of the command of his Father. He voluntarily subordinates himself to the will of
Yes,
the Father
yes.
over and over and over and
Yes.
over. So everything he does is not because he has no choice.
Right.
He chooses to obey the command, which is rooted in the love relationship between the Father and the Son. And this is going to be the foundation for then what he tells his disciples about how we love and how we demonstrate our love by obeying his commands. We'll get to this when we get to John 14, 15, 16. That it's the same for us. How do we demonstrate love for Jesus? By obeying his commands the same way that the Son demonstrated love for the Father, which was subordinating himself to the command.
It keeps nagging at me as with this discussion, because I think the sin, we're fully equipped. He tells us whatever we need to live a righteous, godly life. And I'm not called to lay down my life, but I'm called to lay down my sin. And it's a choice. And I have to choose when except he totally equipped me to do that.
That's right.
But I fight the sin. I just gotta say this one thing. I gotta say this one thing. And man, it's such a wrestling match. I'm so glad that Christ didn't get to this point there. I'm not sure at this point.
And also too, I mean, like you said, even before the crucifixion, and I think a lot of us do this, where it's like, I don't want to let this sin go. It gives me power, it gives me the upper hand, it makes me feel like I can, massage my pride, right? But even Jesus said, if you would, let this cup pass, but your will be done. So it's like, even in that, he so, exemplifies how we ought to approach God with our sin. It's like, Lord, I know I'm in sin, and I don't want to let it go, but your will be done, and I'm going to obey you. So much of what he did, and I mean, it's just exactly how we ought to approach these issues.
And just furthering that point is that we can take, as we try to be more Christ-like, how he demonstrates his love for the Father, we can demonstrate our love for him by sacrificing.
Yes.
And this is a great season of sacrifice. So as we try to be more like him, so he sacrificed himself out of love for his Father. And so what can we sacrifice and give up out of love for him? And how great is that?
Well, and just going on with what you said, there's a sense in which the cost is the same for all of us, because the cost is yourself. When Jesus says, we'll get to this, I think, in chapter 12, when he says, if you want to follow me, what do? Deny yourself, take up your cross, follow Jesus. If you're carrying a cross and following Jesus, where are you going?
Wilderness.
To die.
To
To
die.
die to yourself.
You're not carrying a cross because it's your burden to carry around. You're carrying a cross because it's an instrument of death. And you are handing your life over to him and saying, now you command me. Everything I have belongs to you, even if it costs me my life. Like, my life is yours, and we all pay that price if we're followers of Jesus.
It's not just a burden.
No,
It's a transformation.
That's
It's
right.
It's exactly like you said.
that's right. But Jesus is the shepherd who goes ahead of us. He doesn't ask us to do that when he's not willing to do it himself. He says, follow me. If you follow your good shepherd, and you're taken across with you, your shepherd's leading you to death to yourself, which is freedom. That's where freedom from sin is found.
And it's also like, what's on the other side of that process? So you died with yourself, and then ultimately, God refers to himself as the rock. He will never disappoint you. Once you're on the other side of that process, which I think we go through for our whole life, and never quite get there until he brings us to glory, you get these moments of, oh my gosh, I get it. When my identity, when my self-worth, when my self-confidence, when my purpose in life is based on Christ, I am never going to be disappointed, because it's not based on the fickle things of this world. It's based on, the unconditional love that we have in our Savior.
Yeah. You get God.
Right. Right.
And I think there are loads of people who are like, that's it? That's all I get? I just get God? No, you get God. You get God. I mean, the flip side of deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus is the parable that Jesus told about the man who finds a treasure in a field, realizes the value of what he's found, goes and sells everything he owns, and then buys this field. And he doesn't do it reluctantly. He does it joyfully because he realizes what he's got. So, if you just say, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus, that sounds awfully depressing. But if you know that actually the other side of that is that you get the treasure in the field, that you get God, there is no sacrifice he can ask from you that's not worth it. Because of what you get. You get Christ, you get God, you get eternity secured for you. And you get tastes of all of that stuff in this life too. It's not just that it's all relegated to the other side of glory. It's now we get God, we get fellowship with God, we get brought into relationship with God. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so how do the Jews react to all that teaching from Jesus about the shepherd and the gate and everything?
No, they're still arguing.
Yeah.
They still can't come to grips with it, because they say there's a division among them because of the words. And some of them say he has a demon, some of them say he's insane, why listen to him? And others are saying, well, if he has a demon, that can't be right, because demons can't open the eyes of the blind, can he?
That's right.
Can.
Yeah,
That's my Bible said how
That's
Bible
right.
puts it.
so I myself, I don't know what demon-possessed people typically talk about, but I'm guessing it's not things like being a good shepherd and dying for your people. I'm just guessing that's not what they say. And, and do evil spirits go, just listen to the irony of that Jesus just did a miracle that fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah 42, that the Messiah would open the eyes of the blind, and there are people standing there saying he must be demon-possessed. What? Like, no. Demons don't open people's eyes, physically or spiritually, and that's what Jesus is doing. What's really interesting is right here in 19 to 21, you see the sheep dividing. You see people who are starting to recognize the voice of their shepherd. And some of the people are like, this is ridiculous and I'm out of here, this guy's crazy. And there are other people saying, he can't be crazy. There's something here. Like, who is he? Yeah, the sheep are dividing. Just even as they're hearing all of this teaching from Jesus. Now, I don't know how many of those people actually come around, but I have no doubt there are legitimate sheep standing in that group who are starting to think, this is the guy. This is the guy, and whatever else the Pharisees will do to me, this is the guy. This has to be the truth. Okay. I better stop there. Comments? Things that made an impression on you? Anything you want to add?
I have to say
Mine too, actually. I always read this section in isolation from everything else, but when you connect it to the story of the blind man, it just suddenly, it's just a lot bigger than I thought it was.
And to
Yeah.
Ezekiel 34.
Yeah. All right, we will stop there.